You are listening to CEO Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.
Welcome to this episode of CEO Perspectives, a signature series by the Conference Board. CEO Perspectives are conversations that take an objective, nonpartisan look at a range of subjects that matter most to business leaders. To help make sense of these topics, we sit down with thought leaders and do what we do best at the Conference Board, provide trusted insights for what's ahead. I'm Steve Odland, the CEO of the Conference Board and the host of this series. And in today's program, we're going to have a wide-ranging conversation on the role of the corporate board. How has it changed over time? What's the difference between public and private boards? What does a dysfunctional board look like? And what can be done to fix some of those issues? So joining me today is Constantine Alexandrakis, the CEO of Russell Reynolds and an expert in all things boards of directors. Constantine, welcome.
Thank you, Steve. It's great to be here.
So, Constantine, you obviously serve on your own company's board of directors, but you have been advising boards for as long as I can remember because you've advised me and my companies and everybody I know. Talk about, what your experience has been generally in this area.
So there are a number of components to the work I've done, not as a board member, but as a member of Russell Reynolds board and CEO team. We help companies and organizations recruit board members. We help them evaluate the effectiveness of their boards. We help them think about long-term CEO succession planning at the CEO level and kind of everything in between. As you know, Steve, every organization is different. And even though we do those things for organizations around the world, each time we do them, there's a slightly different problem you're trying to solve or type of issue that you're trying to address.
Yeah, now, some people, everybody knows what a board of director is, but, people may not understand what the legal duties or exact duties of a board. Can you just kind of highlight for us, for our listeners, what are the specific duties of a board of directors?
So in the United States, there are certain fiduciary duties involved with the board of directors, depending on the state that they're incorporated in. There's some variations between the states, but overall, the fiduciary duty of a board of directors is to oversee the financials and endorse the submissions of the company about its performance. And in doing so, the board has a duty to shareholders to ensure that the company and management are delivering on building shareholder value and doing so in an honest and ethical way. I mean, that's an oversimplification, but there are a number of laws and compliance norms behind that support what I just described.
Yeah, and people typically talk about them in terms of the duties, the duty of care, loyalty, and good faith. And the reason I start with that is because it's just so important that people understand what underpins everything that goes on in a boardroom. And this is how board members think and engage with management teams and all the multi-stakeholders, right?
Absolutely. And the thing about it is that, and I know we'll get into this, that those duties are real. Those duties are taken seriously by shareholders, by institutional investors, by board members themselves. And that's part of the reason why there's also insurance that supports board members in their roles to ensure that when things go wrong, there's insurance to support any miscues that may have occurred in that relationship.
Yeah, when we started in our career, the thing that, if you talk to a board and you said, what do you focus on? They would say, well, we're focused on producing shareholder value. But the whole world has changed and the boardroom is no exception. We're living in a multi-stakeholder world of customers, employees, owners, community, and the board of directors' duties have to align to all those stakeholders, right?
They do, increasingly so. You're right. It was a couple of decades ago, there was more of a single focus on shareholder value. And now as the world has become more complicated, as the demands from institutional investors and other shareholder holders have become more complicated, There's a multi-stakeholder view in how the board needs to operate. And that certainly increases the pressure on board members to deliver in new and different ways.
Yeah. And it also, if you, a lot of people say, oh, I watched some movie and so I know what a board of director does. I don't know if I've ever seen a movie that's got an accurate depiction of anything I've seen in a boardroom. But, there is this whole notion that the board used to be, a bunch of buddies sitting around and so forth. That world's, that's ancient history. Talk about what the boardroom of today looks like.
Well, and Steve, as you know, to the degree to which that mythology about how it used to be is accurate, it's not completely truth, right? But today, boards have a sense of obligation to all the stakeholders we just talked about. There's serious work to do around issues not only related to strategy and the finances of the organization, but related to sustainability, related to succession, both at the CEO level and at management levels. So boards have become much more working groups in many ways, but still very much focused on governance rather than operations. And that line, the movement of that line has not changed, although at times it becomes a little nebulous.
Yeah. And I think, whereas maybe in the past, they tended to be people who were local to the company headquarters and known to the management team, it changed dramatically to the point where, it was less so friends of the CEO and more into what I would call the compliance era where, the CEO didn't know any of the board members and so forth. It seems like things are shifting back a little bit, but talk about the independence of the board director today and their role with the CEO.
So independence is a critical element of governance today, and institutional investors are really taking a critical eye to make sure that boards are acting in the best interest of shareholders versus cozying up too much to the CEO. And that objectivity around where's the company going, around what are the challenges and opportunities, that's something that's increasingly demanded of board members. And it's facilitated by what you just described, Steve, which is having board members who aren't necessarily familiar with the CEO or aren't familiar with one another, who bring diverse perspectives, diverse experiences from different parts of the country, sometimes different parts of the world, to the table in order to ensure the company is on the right path.
Yeah, and these are referred to as the independent or outside board members, and they really are independent. They're not beholden to the management team or vice versa. So it gives a level of oversight that is truly high quality for all the stakeholders.
Yes, but independence should not mean conflict or opposition, right? So it's independence from a constructive, objective business experience perspective, which should be complementary and additive to what management is trying to accomplish.
Well, and that's why you use the term working group, which I really like, because there has to be collegiality in the boardroom. There's got to be all the independent points of view, but at the end of the day, you can't have multiple strategies to run a company. The management and the board needs to be aligned around a certain strategy, and you can only execute in one direction.
That's exactly correct. And it's surprising to us sometimes. It's always wonderful to be in a boardroom and to hear perfect alignment between the board and the management team on the company strategy, and they're all using the same language and the same vision, and there's really good collaboration on that. There are instances, though, Steve, no surprise to you, I'm sure, that we go in and we're helping boards evaluate themselves or think about the future, and there's a gap between what the board thinks the strategy is and what management thinks the strategy is, or there's a gap in understanding or articulation of it. And that's a red flag.
Yeah. And so then what do you do?
We help the board and the management team kind of articulate that gap and facilitate a conversation around how to close it. Very often, part of the problem is, Steve, that the gap hasn't been diagnosed. So diagnosing is half of the solution for sure.
Yeah, they're just not aware sometimes that there isn't complete either understanding or alignment. So the facilitation from the outside becomes a really important piece of that and a great dynamic.
Completely agree.
Yeah. if you're thinking about a board today, I mean, you're in a lot of boardrooms. What does the ideal board look like? I mean, you can talk about in terms of characteristics from an independence perspective, skill sets, diversity. How would you articulate it?
I think the ideal board is comprised of senior business leaders who have a broad strategic perspective that's relevant to the organization's business and success going forward. So what does that mean? That means that it's not a collection of specialists. So the tech person, the supply chain person, the finance person. It's a collection of leaders who've had broad experiences, who bring a broad strategic perspective to the table. But it's also ones who bring very diverse perspectives. And by diverse, I don't just mean what the person looks like, what their gender is, what their ethnicity is. That's all very important. But it's also having experienced different challenges in their own careers, in their own businesses, having had different exposure to different customer groups, stakeholder groups, having led transformative efforts in different ways and faced different challenges in doing so. That sort of diversity of experience and perspective is critical to a successful board. In fact, there are statistics out there that show that the more diverse and varied a board is, the more additive it is to shareholder value over the long term.
It's really interesting to hear you talk about the various functions. For a while, it was very popular to say, we need a director in here who's an expert at IT because we're worried about cybersecurity and everything else. But, the problem with that is that then the board starts, or that individual is expected to sort of start leaning into what management should be doing. And I think most boards have now kind of come back to what you have described, which is everybody needs to be a generalist here, not try to run parts of the company.
You're exactly right, Steve. There was a movement, especially after some of the big cyber attacks of 5 years ago, that, every company needs a cyber person on their board. The problem with that is it's very often the case that if a person like that goes on the board, they will be unlikely to comment or contribute to other elements if they're not broader. That's one piece of it. And the other piece of it is a board can always hire a cyber consultant or a compliance consultant or somebody who can bring in the expertise they need at a narrower level whenever they need it.
The other thing that you do a lot of is, we've talked about public company boards, but you're in a lot of private companies. And in the past, private companies have, because they're private, they're owned by an individual or, a family. They typically have not had the same kind of board representation, but that's changing, isn't it?
It is. It really is. If you look over the last 10, 15 years, Steve, private company boards are starting to look or starting to adapt many of the elements of public company boards because it makes good business sense to do so, to have that objective outside expertise that can help you achieve your goals faster. But there are still differences between public and private company boards. Private company boards tend to be a little more informal. They tend to sometimes meet more often and be more hands-on and get pulled into things that they may not necessarily get pulled into in a public company board. There's also, as you referenced, a dynamic there around who the owners are. Is there family involved? There's a private equity. Obviously, those individuals will often have an outsized point of view on how things need to happen, and a board member in a private organization needs to adapt his or her contributions to be complementary to that.
We're talking about the role of the board of directors of corporations. We're going to take a short break, and we'll be right back.
As you and your company monitor the volatile and uncertain economy, the award-winning forecast team at the Conference Board predicts a downturn by the end of 2022. Recession will further compound the crises that have recently upended expectations, from a deadly pandemic to a war in Ukraine and the highest inflation in decades. Yet, unprecedented crises also present unforeseen opportunities if you have a trusted, proven navigator by your side. With that in mind, and as the Conference Board has always done, we are providing you with daily, timely, and relevant content that will guide the business community through the economic storm. These trusted insights are being gathered on our website and are available to help your company master the challenges. To find out how you can chart a course for the future which will allow your business to emerge stronger on the other side, visit our free economic hub entitled Navigating the Economic Storm, your indispensable guide through the global recession, located at conference-board.org/topics/recession.
Welcome back to CEO Perspectives. I'm your host, Steve Odland, the CEO of the Conference Board, and I'm joined today by Constantine Alexandrakis, the CEO of Russell Reynolds Associates. So, Constantine, before the break, we were talking about how boards and management teams have to work together in a collegial fashion. They've got to be one team to lead the company. So, how does a board and a management team act with their, bring their independence, bring their different experiences and point of views? How do they engage? How does that, what do those dynamics look like so that you can then align around a certain strategy?
So the engagement starts with a structured set of meetings that occur each year. There are agendas. You might have your one meeting might be annually devoted to strategy topics. One meeting may be devoted to people topics. One meeting may be devoted to international operations. Whatever it is, whatever the specifics are of that company. There's a common thread through that of, in every conversation, there are financial reports, detailed drill downs on that, and other basic compliance and governance functioning activities that take place in that. So that creates a framework, Steve, for the interactions that occur on an annual cycle. Within that framework, management is helping the board build an understanding of the business opportunities and challenges, cultivating a conversation in those meetings around those pieces. And between those formal meetings, the CEO will interact with board members to get their input on certain things that are happening along the way. Often management team, the CEO will ask the board member to interact with different elements of the management team. They might ask them to have conversations with investors. All of that depends on the company and the flow of their annual cycle. But I would summarize it by saying there are formal interactions in meetings, and then there are informal interactions between that help bring the board's expertise into the company.
Okay, so let's take a bit of conflict then. Let's just say you have a board. Let's just say I'm a director of a board, and I'm seeing what the management is recommending from a strategic perspective, but I don't completely agree. How do you advise me to engage? What should I do? Because I don't want to be disruptive. I don't want to embarrass anyone, and maybe I'm wrong. What's the best way for boards to interact when they disagree?
The board members are there to give their point of view. So it's important that their voice is heard, and that when they disagree on something, that they communicate that. But it has to be in a constructive and additive way, just like in any business setting. The best board members that we've observed are the ones who communicate their perspective through asking questions and through trying to understand the different drivers and levers in a situation before declaring that they disagree about something. Because often by asking questions, your disagreement might get addressed, or you might be able to strengthen your disagreement and provide better context with it. So I would not advise a board member to ever hold back their point of view, but I would advise a board member to provide it in a constructive way that is additive to the process that the board is undertaking.
Yeah, and these management teams do this all day, every day, 7 days a week. I mean, this is what they do, and so if they're coming up with something, typically there's more behind it than you can you can put on a slide, a PowerPoint slide. So, it's a lot of times it's just trying to understand why. What else did you look at? What were the pros and cons? And, it's learning how they thought about it. And, oftentimes boards go, aha, now I get it. Now I know why they ended up here. It makes more sense rather than just saying, oh, you're wrong, or you shouldn't be doing it that way. Right.
Right. But even there, Steve, they might have some ahas, but they still might disagree. And that's important to still resolve amongst that group, whether it happens in the meeting or it happens offline, because at the end of the day, going back to what we said earlier, you do want the board and the leadership of the company unified in their view of where the company is heading. So disagreements should not be swept under the carpet. And one of the worst things we see in boards is this tendency towards groupthink, which would fly in the face of what I just described.
Yeah. Now, you talked earlier about dysfunction that you've seen among boards, and obviously this is your business. I mean, you're called in to help work through that. You're an expert at it. So one thing is you could say, well, if you have any dysfunction on your board, call Constantine. But talk about some of the dysfunction that you've seen, and what does it look like, and how do you work through it?
It probably falls in 2 or 3 categories, Steve. One category is an individual board member, or more than one individual board member, is more about themselves than the company and the board's success. And that may not be consistent for an individual, but there may be moments where they start to put themselves in front of it, whether it's about their role on the board or whether their tenure on the board should be extended, or whether a particular action being taken by the company diverges from their individual point of view, but not from the grand point of view of the organization. So that's probably category number one, an individual kind of putting themselves first when they need to be thinking about the whole. The second category would be when divisions happen within the board and cliques happen. It could be cliques around a certain issue, or it could be cliques around a new set of directors versus a more tenured set of directors. That's also a breakdown that is not constructive to the board's role and what the board needs to be helping the company achieve. So those are probably 2 sources of dysfunction that we see on occasion. The third one would be what we referenced earlier around communication and the board's view of the strategy either being different from what leadership thinks, or they're not having a clear view of strategy. That's a problem.
So, there's a unique player typically in the mix here on boards, and it's usually an independent chair or a lead director who is an independent director. Talk about the role of that individual as it relates to these dynamics.
That individual is kind of like the umpire, right? So that individual is supposed to really ensure that the board's agenda is the right agenda, is closely aligned with what management needs, that when the board is together, it is communicating clearly, that board members are doing their homework, coming into the room and contributing actively and in a value-added way. So it's a role that's really important in ensuring that the board dynamics are running smoothly. It also includes a lot of offline conversations. If someone is having issues with a colleague or is not necessarily pulling their weight as a board member, that chairperson or that lead director needs to work with that person to help resolve the issue.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like a facilitator or a coaching role where, you've got to make sure that all of the players are being productive and interacting in the right way, and being willing to go offline and give feedback, positive and constructive feedback. It's all of that, but that can often deal with some of these stressful or situations, or a dysfunctional situation, with a respected independent chair lead director.
Yes, the best chairpersons are the ones who really bring a sense of ownership and accountability and order, and a really transparent communication among the board and between the board and the organization's leadership.
Yeah, they're almost like diplomats. You think of them like ambassadors, and typically these people are elected or selected as this role from the board. But you have to make that shift then. A lead director or an independent director needs to make that shift from I'm just one of the group to now I really have to be thinking about making sure that this group interacts and is very productive.
Yes, and the best chairpersons, Steve, are the ones where the board members are grateful for the role that the person plays, and the CEO is grateful for the role the person plays. And there are many examples of both of those parties really being respectful and appreciating what a good chairperson does. And it's always great to hear those.
How can people, stakeholders from the outside, like investors or community, how can they from the outside determine whether a company's management and board relationship is very functional?
Steve, that's a really tough question. To be perfectly honest, A, I don't know that they accurately can, and B, I don't know that they should really be worrying about that at that granular level. At the end of the day, investors and other outsiders need to be worrying about the company's performance, the company delivering on its obligations to its communities, to its stakeholders, and ultimately delivering value and in a high integrity way to the groups that it serves. In order to do a deep dive on whether management and the board are really working well together, if company performance or other things don't look right with the company, that's probably the moment to try to understand if the board and management teams are themselves organized in the right way, contain the right people, and whether there are issues blocking effective leadership on either side.
Yeah, and you see a lot of activism or activist shareholders or activist groups coming and either attacking or trying to engage. It's not always an attack. There's oftentimes an attempt to productively engage. But this is where activism starts, I guess, isn't it, Constantine? With some sort of a view that there's some disconnect going on.
Absolutely, that's exactly right. So if there is an issue, that's the classic role of the activist is to come in and try to identify it and unearth it. Now, it may not have anything to do with a disconnect between the board and management. It could have to do with where investments are taking place or the strategy itself. But that's where activists spend their time. And in many cases, they've constructively raised issues that otherwise would not have been raised.
Yeah, and that's why it's so important for boards themselves, as well as the management teams, to engage with outside investors and interested parties, because they need to demonstrate, how they're working and why they're working, and have that conversation so that they don't attract activism, right?
Well, and Steve, some of the best boards, best functioning boards that I've seen, like to think of themselves as wearing the activist hat at all times, so that they're working with management to really drive the business forward constructively. And that in turn decreases the need for an actual activist to appear, because they're thinking like the activists at all times.
That's great words of advice. Constantine, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Steve. It was a pleasure.
And thanks to all of you for listening in to CEO Perspectives. Every week, I'll be joined by a prominent thought leader to provide insights on the issues of our time. We'll cover the leading topics in economics, geopolitics, public policy, and more. Please share CEO Perspectives with your colleagues, with your friends, with your family. I know they're going to want to listen. I'm Steve Odland, and this podcast has been brought to you by the Conference Board.
You've been listening to a podcast from the Conference Board, the indispensable ally that has helped businesses through war, recession, and economic transformation for over 100 years. As recent unexpected economic challenges persist, You can chart a course for the future, which will allow your business to emerge stronger on the other side. Just visit our free economic hub entitled Navigating the Economic Storm, your indispensable guide through the global recession, located at www.conference-board.org/topics/recession.